All right, what's going on, folks? This is your boy Luke Gibbons.
This is Elizabeth Guzman Arroyo.
And you are listening to Colonized Minds, the podcast. What's going on, Elizabeth?
Well, we have a special guest with us today.
We do. We have a very special guest. Very cool guy. One of my best friends. But also, I would say, one of the most intelligent and I think brilliant minds of this generation. Has a lot to live up to. No, someone who's actually very active, very critical, very much doing the work, and I think a great and shining example of how you can marry different worlds, how you can be both an intellectual and someone who is for the people. Again, very good friend of mine. I shouted him out at the last podcast, and just as serendipity would have it, we actually have him here today. So my boy, Mr. Rudy Mondragon. Rudy, what's going on, man?
Good to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. And yeah, just serendipity works out in our favor sometimes. And found myself in Portland today, and I'm glad to be joining two great minds. And thank you for the words. I'm sure I turned red when you were
like beat red.
Beat red.
You know, it's funny because he literally talks about you all the time.
I do. Yeah, you're my role model, Rudy.
Likewise, I'm just trying to be like you, Luke.
Nah, don't do that. Nah, so Rudy, obviously I know you, but I'm gonna assume that outside of our league, our fantasy football league, and some of the people we're gonna forward this to, a lot of our listeners might not know who you are. So if you could just tell the people, who you are, tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, what you've done, and what you're doing.
Yeah, so originally born and raised in Southeast Los Angeles. Big shout out to Southgate. I just recently moved back there, so it's good to come back in full circle. But the journey started there. I was a student athlete all my life, and athletics is what got me into a 4-year institution at the University of California, Irvine. And so I earned a Division I scholarship to play soccer there. And for me, that's where my journey went and deviated into a different path. And so I grew up always an athlete, gifted athlete, got me into college, and at UC Irvine is where I really began thinking about social justice issues, but more from like the books, not really on the ground, but really learning about Chicano studies, Chicana and Chicano history, the struggles and the stories that came from the communities that I had been in as a result of soccer. For example, having played at Lincoln High School at one time in the Los Angeles area, and not knowing when I was in high school, stepping onto that soccer field, that's where the Chicano student movement was taking place in the 60s. So Irvine got me into grad school, where I was able to work on a master's in higher ed student affairs and work in the field for about 5 years. And again, I reached a point in my career where I was doing the work of multicultural diversity affairs, social justice work, and I loved what I was doing, but I've always kind of had it in the back of my head that I was going to go back for a PhD, even though I resisted it so much. The idea of doing research in undergrad as a first-generation college student was something I just did not want to do.
Surprise.
Right. Talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so research for me to me, it didn't make sense. Growing up first generation, seeing working class family members doing work with their hands, doing work with their physical bodies, there was something that was being produced. My dad was a construction worker, and he made toilets, made the tanks of toilets for this company that actually left Los Angeles in the early 2000s, but definitely a product of like the industrialization and industry just leaving California to go for cheaper places and cheaper labor. And so I grew up seeing that. And so research for me was like, what? Like I'm going to do research and write about it. Like that just didn't appeal to me.
Yeah.
But a lot of it, as a first generation student, I think for me it was like this insecurity, this like fear of failure, and the reality is that we sometimes experience imposter syndrome. And to this day, I'm 31 and I'm in a PhD program doing research and doing what I love. But you still have moments where you question yourself for a little bit. But you get older and you develop the skills, the coping mechanisms to be able to get past it. But when I was an undergrad, I just didn't think research was for me. But now, reflecting, I wish I had seen research as something I could have done, because now I'm thinking about maybe even doing some projects that involve not just me, but like in my positionality, but also like my community where I grew up. And so trying to give something back to my community where it's not just academic and intellectual, but it's also accessible to the people that I grew up with. And that's that's how I eventually got into research. So shout out to my mentor also, Dr. Jeanette Castellanos, who's at UC Irvine. She always told me, do research, get into a PhD program, and I always resisted that idea. But I'm glad I'm there. But we all take different paths.
Yeah, we do. It's funny. You touched on a lot of different things that we've talked about so far. And
throughout the podcast. Yeah,
I promise you, Rudy, as close a friend as he is, has not listened to all the podcasts. So it's crazy that he actually started. This is how you spend a lot of time with somebody when like y'all are kind of talking about the same stuff, even when you're not necessarily talking to each other. So yeah.
And that's happened actually several times now, where we'll talk about a subject and then like Dr. Sarah
Goldrick,
right, exactly, coming in and talking about how students finance higher education when we were just talking about that the day before.
Gotcha. Yeah, but no. So you're talking like you're doing research now. You're in a PhD program. If you could just tell folks a little bit about your PhD program, what you are researching and pursuing.
Yeah, so I'm at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, and my PhD is this interdisciplinary program and department called Chicana and Chicano Studies. And Chicana and Chicano Studies is, broadly speaking, the study of the Southwest of Mexican American, but also expanding it to not just Mexican American, but Mexican transnationally, Latinas and Latinos. But also moving into the intersectionalities of gender, sexuality, examining those different stories. And so, with the emergence of like these identities of Latinx, Chicanx, to really embrace and holistically look at how this idea of intersectionality happens. And we try to within the paradigm that we're in right now with research, trying to really bring forth these ideologies, non-traditional ideologies, counter narratives, counter testimonials. And so in this PhD program, for me, something that I noticed two things. One was my passion, obviously, for sport. And I've been watching the sport of boxing since 1992. And I still remember the day that I went to my Uncle Feli's house. The reason why we went to his house was because for a lot of first-generation cats that grew up in the early 90s, if your uncle or your aunt had a black box, that's where you would go to watch the fights. Black box is basically live streaming of today. It's where you got bootleg cable.
Yeah. For us, it was, somebody orders the fight on pay-per-view, but they record it on their VCR, and then the tape gets passed around from house to house. Yeah.
Yeah. So, since 1992, I've had this passion for boxing and soccer. I obviously have that experience. And in Chicano studies, something I saw that wasn't really being done by a lot of scholars in the field is sport, critical study of sport. And so getting into this PhD program, I initially thought I was going to do a study on like 16th century indigeneity located in central Mexico to examine Christian hegemony, the tools of white supremacy.
I remember us actually talking about this. Yeah.
Yeah. So, the value of that for a first gen doctoral student or pre-doctoral student for me at that time in 2014 was just the idea of having an idea like that I came up with. Because growing up, I always had mentors tell me, you could look at this, you can do that, pursue these careers. But this was like, okay, I finally came up and solidified an idea that I had like some traction and wheels under. But then, a lot of doctoral students, they get into their first year and then they change their topic. I said my topic deviated completely from the original topic and really started to look at, well, what expertise do I bring to this doctoral program? And so it was my expertise in sport, having talked on podcasts, having talked on radio stations, having blogged about it for the past 5 years, having had conversations with friends, family, anybody about boxing. And so I thought, this academic program at UCLA, I was at Santa Barbara to begin with, but then I moved over to UCLA. I was like, I bring this expertise and these faculty members have their own expertise. And so now it's, utilizing a Chicana and Chicano and Chicanx framework, research framework to really utilize boxing as a window to examine the subjectivities and the performances of race, manhood, masculinity, immigration, nationality, and the ways that boxers perform resistance. And so that's basically my project in a nutshell. And that's what I'm doing at UCLA.
And so you have a website, right? What is it called?
It's bloodmoneyboxing.com.
There we go. That's what it is.
And if you could, just a little bit about the name Blood Money Boxing, where that comes from.
That name was conceptualized by Jared Bato. Shout out to another good friend of ours. He came at me one day and he said, "Hey, bro, what do you think about this title, Blood Money Boxing?" And basically, what Blood Money Boxing is, in boxing, a lot of fans gravitate towards this idea of blood, the blood spectacle, the kill or be killed kind of matches. When you have fighters who aren't that style, people tend to hate on them and say that they're boring, that they're not about the people, that they are, running in the ring, and basically unfair critiques.
Gotcha. I.e. Floyd Mayweather.
Right.
Yeah.
Andre Ward.
I love Floyd. I love
Rigondeaux.
Andre Ward. Yeah. Guillermo Rigondeaux. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So that's the blood aspect of it. And then the money aspect of it, I think, is not just the political economy of boxing, but also the industry. We attempt to look at the industry and the politics behind just the blood spectacle. That is the sweet science, right? And so blood money boxing is a way to engage in dialogue and discourse about the sport of boxing, but also look at some of the politics that are being played out.
Right.
And so, for example, Canelo and Amir Khan. Canelo is a Mexican fighter from Mexico, and Amir Khan is a Muslim, I believe Pakistani boxer
I believe so.
from England, right?
Yeah.
And so it was a very complex array of identities and subjectivities. And so I wrote a piece because on Twitter I saw that somebody was using the images from Street Fighter, your fight with like Street Fighter Super Nintendo,
right? Yeah.
So someone took the Blanca character and I think it was the Yogi character from India, like a very essentially very stereotypical image.
Yeah.
And so they got that image of the Yogi, the yoga guy, and Blanca, and said Canelo was Blanca and Amir Khan was the Indian guy. And so very essentialist ways to portray and represent these fighters. And then some folks were saying that this fight was huge. There was a sportscaster for ESPN, Dan Rafael, and he was like, this fight is huge, and he was channeling his inner Donald Trump. And so then it became an article of like racial, ethnic subjectivities and identities that are essentialized, and then also a conversation about Donald Trump. All right, so if this boxing commentator is going to bring Donald Trump to the conversation, then let's really talk about the implications of something like that. So we try to look at the narratives and the politics and break those down.
It's actually really, really interesting to me.
Yeah.
Because that isn't a correlation that I would have made. And I feel like oftentimes when people are talking about different issues of like equity and inclusion, social justice, they're thought about in a really mainstream sort of way. And a lot of people don't connect them into like everyday life, like boxing.
And I think that's one of the things I found, or whatever degree of success that I've been able to have, I think is in being able to explain these concepts and do these things, I think has been in the ability to connect it to things that that an audience can identify with. And so being able to see what's going on like on the surface, but then being able to see what's going on like beneath the surface and having that understanding gives one the ability to then connect it to something else, right? And so I've especially seen that true with like working with our students, like so you using boxing like as a way to talk about how oppression acts, right, or how capitalism may act, or racism may manifest itself. I think the mistake a lot of times that we make sometimes as educators and folks who are doing social justice work is that we get very familiar with using the language and very familiar with kind of like like you're saying before, like the research aspect of it, but we don't necessarily have the ability to connect that to something that people care about in a different way. And so like for you, because you grew up very in tune to boxing, very much like that's, you're connected to that on a very different level, like being able to have like memories, right? Using sports, like those memories that come up, by participating in sport as a young child. So when you can take something that connects with somebody on such a deep level, and then you can take this very complicated, complex topic and you can connect those two things, it gives one the ability to really be able to speak to people in a way you can't when you kind of ignore those two things, or you're unable to see how they're connected.
So I have a question. Where do you think institutions go wrong in their equity and inclusion work?
I think when it comes in higher education institutions go wrong, I believe when the students' voices aren't heard. I think all policy, the development of programs, the development of cultural centers, for example, like this one, have historically been informed by needs that students have. And so I think because, now I'm experiencing this as I get a little bit older, and now that I've been removed from the higher ed game, I'm not as connected to maybe not the literature for sure, because I've been exposed to different literature for the doctoral program. But you get older and you get a little bit more into like leadership positions, and you start working less and less and less with students, like interacting with them on a regular basis. And so it's I think prime and key moments like that where intentionality behind like implementing focus groups, implementing town halls, implementing places and spaces where students can begin to voice collectively their concerns and their needs, to be able to get the pulse of the people on campus, to be able to then inform the policies and procedures that get placed in the university. And also resources, equity and diversity centers like this one oftentimes don't get the right funding, and they're seen kind of like they're ghettoized, like academic departments like Black Studies or Chicano Studies or American Studies, and because they get ghettoized and they get kind of marginalized, the money isn't getting put into these departments to be able to get them to a place that they can grow and be self-sufficient and sustainable and serve the students that they have, whether you're an administrator or an academic. So I think the resources and being very intentional and serious about these departments and offices and inclusion and equity work, not just the folks that are doing the equity work. It takes like a whole village. It takes a whole campus community to be able to implement equity and inclusion policies within, all the way from like the president's office down to the custodial staff, to be honest, and including everybody in there.
Right. There was something that you said there. I want to, so for folks who may have missed it, use the term ghettoized. If you could explain to the folks what you mean specifically by that.
Yeah, like when I say ghettoized, I mean, it could be used in different contexts, but so like in my work, for example, like there's this, the topic of boxing, for example, it could be set as a ghettoized topic of study because either no one's studying it or they kind of push it to the side as seeing it not like of value. The ghettoization of cultural centers or academic units that do diversity and inclusion work, it's housing them away from the students or housing them in unproductive locations on campus. So not just physically, but also discursively. So folks not talking, housing not talking to the folks that are doing equity and inclusion work, career services not talking to the folks that are doing equity and diversity work. And so it's this idea of like marginalizing them both physically and discursively and not engaging or not including them into the conversation.
Gotcha.
That's how it,
Well, no, it's great that you kind of clarified that because I think that also that happens often, right? And not just to the centers, to the students as well. So it's like what we talked about. I think it was we didn't air this part, but I'll go ahead and say it, even though we didn't air it. One of the things that we find very often, like, is when a student is going to another department and they need assistance or they need help with something, right? Assistance or help in the department that provides that, but that student is then referred here to the Multicultural Center for that very same assistance. And so what it's essentially saying is like, no, this service isn't actually, if you go there, go to the Multicultural Center, they can help you, right? So we're going to dismiss you and put you over there, as opposed to if you're not ghettoizing the center or the person, being able to understand that like part of your job as well is to assist and to serve that person, and that they are as ingrained in the student community and the college community as anyone else. So one of the things I wanted to ask you is, as someone who, when I met you, you were very much working directly with students in a kind of an academic professional type capacity, and now you're still doing some work or doing work with students more kind of in a faculty type of capacity. Working specifically with students of color, I mean, what do you think is kind of the biggest issue that students are facing right now in attempting to navigate college?
For a TA is like supporting the students who are implicated or impacted by some of the things that students will say in the classroom that are not necessarily the most open. So my student affairs background is very helpful in that situation, I think, because I'm able to better identify, I think, in situations if students are feeling like kind of isolated or marginalized, or if they were triggered from something that a student said in the class. And, sometimes these are microaggressions, and microaggressions being like these micro assaults that are informed by systemic issues of dominant ideologies that are, enacted on underrepresented students and marginalized students. Like better identifying those situations that take place in the classroom in an academic setting. Given that I have that background of having worked in student affairs profession for over 5 years, it helps, but it's still challenging. It's very challenging.
So I think we're actually running out of time.
We are.
So one of the announcements that we have for today is that this evening from 6 to 7 p.m., we are actually going to be hosting a live podcast, a live Colonized Minds podcast that will be discussing the election. So you can tune in on our live stream on Facebook through our Facebook page, and that would be Cascade Multicultural-Center.
And also, as always, we're on YouTube, Colonized Minds Podcast. If you type it in, it will come up. And I would say subscribe, right? That way, when these come out, you can get Elizabeth's emails, but you can also get emails to like your own personal account. So go ahead and subscribe to Colonized Minds Podcast. And we also are working on some really, really big things that we are hoping that we can talk about next week. So stay tuned, because we're going to have some big announcements coming up. Or maybe they're not really big announcements. It's just big to us because we're subjective like that. So at any rate, this has been Luke Givens.
And this is Elizabeth Guzman Arroyo.
And we had a special guest today, Mr. Rudy Mondragon. All of us saying, so what if it's true?